Ensuring ethical sourcing, the role of importer security filing in preventing forced labor in supply chains. ISF mandates documentation of supply chain transparency, including information on suppliers and production processes, enabling authorities to trace the origin of goods and detect potential instances of forced labor. ISF enables authorities to verify the ethical sourcing practices of importers, ensuring compliance with labor standards and human rights principles and reducing the risk of forced labor in supply chains. ISF supports risk assessment for industries prone to forced labor, such as agriculture, textiles, and electronics, allowing authorities to target inspections and enforcement actions to prevent labor exploitation. ISF integration with ethical certification systems, such as fair trade or responsible sourcing, facilitates the verification of labor standards compliance and promotes the adoption of ethical sourcing practices in supply chains. ISF encourages collaboration between customs authorities and labor rights organizations to share information, conduct risk assessments, and develop strategies for combating forced labor in supply chains. ISF audits and inspections may include checks for labor compliance, ensuring that importers uphold fair labor practices and ethical standards in their supply chains to prevent the exploitation of workers. ISF imposes penalties for non-compliance with labor standards and ethical sourcing requirements, deterring importers from engaging in practices that contribute to forced labor or human trafficking. ISF requires importers to implement enhanced due diligence measures to assess the risk of forced labor in their supply chains, promoting responsible sourcing and ethical trade practices. ISF promotes transparency in labor recruitment processes by documenting information on suppliers, subcontractors, and recruitment agencies, reducing the risk of exploitation and human trafficking. ISF encourages stakeholder engagement and consultation with labor rights advocates, civil society organizations, and industry stakeholders to develop strategies for addressing forced labor risks in global supply chains. ISF may include requirements for importers to report on their corporate social responsibility (CSR) initiatives, including efforts to prevent forced labor, promote worker rights, and ensure ethical sourcing practices. ISF may incorporate training programs for customs officials on identifying indicators of forced labor, conducting inspections, and collaborating with labor rights organizations to address labor exploitation in supply chains. ISF facilitates international cooperation and information sharing between customs authorities, labor rights organizations, and other stakeholders to combat forced labor and human trafficking on a global scale. ISF encourages the adoption of supply chain transparency technologies, such as blockchain and digital ledgers, to track the movement of goods and verify compliance with labor standards throughout the supply chain. ISF may include provisions for whistleblower protection mechanisms to encourage individuals to report instances of forced labor or labor exploitation in supply chains without fear of retaliation. ISF promotes community engagement and empowerment initiatives to address the root causes of forced labor, including poverty, lack of education, and social inequality, and promotes sustainable livelihoods. ISF certification programs may be established to recognize importers that demonstrate commitment to ethical sourcing practices, including the prevention of forced labor and exploitation in their supply chains. ISF requirements may influence public procurement standards by encouraging governments to prioritize suppliers that adhere to labor standards and ethical sourcing principles in their procurement processes. ISF fosters collaboration between industry stakeholders, including importers, manufacturers, and retailers, to identify and mitigate risks of forced labor in global supply chains through collective action and shared responsibility. ISF may support awareness campaigns and education initiatives to inform consumers, businesses, and policymakers about the risks of forced labor in supply chains and promote ethical consumption practices. ISF encourages community-led monitoring and oversight mechanisms to empower local communities to monitor labor conditions, report abuses, and hold companies accountable for their supply chain practices. ISF may require importers to conduct labor rights impact assessments to identify and address potential risks of forced labor and human rights abuses in their supply chains, promoting responsible business conduct. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more informative content on customs brokerage services and ethical trade practices.